When I was looking at this data with our team the other night, it was reminiscent of 34 years ago in 1986 when we were struggling for drugs for HIV, and we had nothing. And there was a lot of anecdotal reports about things that maybe they worked, maybe not. People were taking different kinds of drugs. And we did the first randomized placebo-controlled trial with AZT, which turned out to give an effect that was modest.
In 1987, the war on AIDS took another drastic turn for the worse. AZT, a toxic chemotherapy deemed too poisonous for cancer treatment, was approved to treat symptomatic and asymptomatic HIV patients in an attempt to kill the virus that causes AIDS. AZT is a DNA chain terminator, a poison designed to randomly destroy the DNA synthesis of reproducing cells. It was initially developed to treat leukemia victims, but after animal testing, the FDA determined that it was too toxic for use in human beings and banned it. But in 1987, when the AIDS scare hit its height, the FDA was pressured into approving the drug for use for the first time in human beings, even for people who were healthy and showed no sign of AIDS. AZT is highly mutagenic, meaning that it destroys the genes in cells and has been shown to cause cancer in rodents. It targets the bone marrow, where B lymphocyte blood cells are being made. These are the very cells an AIDS patient needs most for immunity. AZT destroys randomly bone marrow, kidneys, liver, intestines, muscle tissue, the brain, and central nervous system. Peter Duesberg claims AZT actually causes AIDS itself.
AZT does directly causing AIDS-defining diseases. You know, AIDS is a lot of things, but it doesn't cause Kaposi sarcoma, I think, but it does cause immunodeficiency. It was designed to do that. It was designed to kill human cells. In fact, the manufacturer says that specifically that it can cause AIDS-like diseases. The manufacturer, that is Spirits Wellcome, says it is often difficult to distinguish adverse events possibly associated with pseudobudin or pseudobudin administration, which is AZT, from underlying signs of HIV disease. In other words, even they acknowledge, not just Duisberg, that AZT causes AIDS or AIDS-defining diseases.
Whenever you have clear-cut evidence that a drug works, you have an ethical obligation to immediately let the people who are in the placebo group know so that they could have access. And all of the other trials that are taking place now have a new standard of care. So we would have normally waited several days until the data gets further, dot the I and cross the T. But the data are not going to change. Some of the numbers may change a little, but the conclusion will not change.
In his book, Poison by Prescription, journalist John Lawrenson explains how AZT tests conducted by the FDA and Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer, were scientifically sloppy and outright fraudulent. During the experiments, patients taking AZT became anemic, suffered low white blood cell counts accompanied by vomiting. Over half had to have blood transfusions. 20% were transfused several times. Despite a warning by FDA toxicology analyst Harvey Chernoff that AZT not be approved, the FDA was pressured by AIDS activist organizations to lift the ban, and hundreds of thousands of people began taking AZT, even though AZT cannot cure AIDS and is only supposed to slow down the progression.
The mortality rate trended towards being better in the sense of less deaths in the remdesivir group. 8% versus 11% in the placebo group. It has not yet reached statistical significance, but the data needs to be further analyzed.
The logic behind AZT treatment is flawed, even if one believes HIV causes AIDS, because HIV only infects about 1 T cell in 1,000. 999 healthy T cells must die to kill the 1 cell that is infected, and this can only happen early on before HIV becomes dormant and is still making DNA. Yet AIDS patients are given AZT for months, on into years, randomly destroying DNA in all parts of the body. AZT is expensive and costs between $8,000 and $12,000 a year, most of which is paid for directly or indirectly by the taxpayer. Burroughs Wellcome, now Glaxo Wellcome, the manufacturer, has generated sales over $1 billion a year with AZT. Because of rules allowed by the FDA, a bottle of AZT that costs about $5 to make can be sold for over $500 as a prescription, and much of this markup is being subsidized by the taxpayer.
The treatment causes a very similar condition we would expect from an AIDS patient. That's why nobody noticed that there was something wrong with the treatment.
I remember in 1992, after I first tested positive, I became involved in an organization called Women at Risk. There were 11 of us at the time on the board and involved in the group. All of us except 3 were on the medications. In the year and a half that I was involved with Women at Risk, every single woman in that organization on the drugs died. Every single one, except the 3 of us who weren't taking them.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it. We considered the FDA not giving us these things as being anti-gay instead of being responsible. And so we went and we lobbied and we pushed for all these things, and we didn't think clearly about what it was we were asking for. It's like that saying, be careful what you ask for, it may come to pass.
Whenever you have clear-cut evidence that a drug works, you have an ethical obligation to immediately let the people who are in the placebo group know so that they can have access. And all of the other trials that are taking place now have a new standard of care. So we would have normally waited several days until the data gets further to dot the I and cross the T. But the data are not going to change. Some of the numbers may change a little, but the conclusion will not change.
ACT UP wanted to speed up the approval process for new drugs.
One of our greatest demonstrations and most famous was at the FDA. And it was over 1,000 demonstrators, almost all people with HIV, demanding to be heard.
I know that there are drugs out there that can save my life, and I want to know why they're not being tested more quickly.
I began to get beyond the rhetoric and the theater of the demonstrations and to really listen to what it is that they were saying. So I invited a group of them up to my conference room, and we spent a couple of hours talking about their concerns. And again, it just confirmed in my own mind that most of their concerns were really quite valid.
So to explain this for people that might be new to this particular kind of fraud, here's how it works. You create a fake activist group to push an agenda seemingly on behalf of society or an oppressed minority, when in fact you're controlling that group for your own purposes. Now, does that mean that everybody who was ever a member of ACT UP or ever went to a demonstration was in on it, in on the game? And the answer is no, because part of the game of creating these fake groups is also to attract legitimate people, mislead them, and weaponize them. And that's exactly what the drug companies did with ACT UP. Now, the question is, were they playing Tony Fauci, or was Tony Fauci playing along? Let's take a close look at an in-depth narrative he gave about his experience with ACT UP. Watch his body language, and you tell me.
Very early on in the course of this pandemic, the activists were making extremely good points about the uniqueness of this, the need to do more, the need to be less rigid in our regulatory approaches towards the approval and testing of new drugs, and the rigidity and lack of flexibility in how we design clinical trials, all of which were the classical way to approach drug development, therapeutic developments, clinical trials, and FDA approval. They wanted to get our attention, so they would do it in a very theatrical way, and they scared a lot, because for the most part, the scientific community and the regulatory community are conservative. And I say conservative, I don't mean conservative in an ideological, political way, but conservative in their approach towards science. it's nice that people are interested who are not scientists, but leave them out of it and lets us scientists make the decision. So they didn't pay much attention to the activists. I, for one reason or other, began reading intensively what they were writing, and even though when they were demonstrating and closing down Wall Street and invading St. Patrick's Cathedral and doing things like that, looking very eccentric and scary to some people, I try to phase that out and just listen to what they said and read what they wrote, and they were making perfect sense. So since I was always out there as a government official, they equated me, my face, my name, with the federal government. So they began to demonstrate against the NIH. And right here on our campus, they, came in, invaded the campus, smoke bombs, wanting to get arrested. And I made probably the best decision in my interaction with community, is that I agreed with what they were saying.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it. We didn't think clearly about what it was we were asking for. It's like that saying, be careful what you ask for, it may come to pass.
The Wellcome Foundation, UK manufacturer of AZT, saw its shares spiral upwards. AZT was to be the new wonder drug. Then, in 1989, after further trials were terminated early in the United States because results looked promising, it was announced that AZT could be used not only on people with AIDS diseases, but in a much larger group, with HIV and low immune cell counts, but no other symptoms. Wellcome's shares soared to new heights, adding £1.4 billion to the company's UK stock market value in one day. Before a drug is licensed for use, it normally has to undergo animal toxicity studies and clinical trials in humans. No long-term animal studies were completed when AZT was licensed. The clinical studies in humans called Phase 2, which led to the licensing of AZT, were financed by Wellcome. They were presented as complying with the only reliable scientific test for a drug, double-blind studies, and published in the New England Journal of Medicine in July 1987.
The study fell apart. I mean, it bombed in so many ways. I showed the article I wrote on it to my colleagues in survey research, and they were absolutely struck down. They could not believe the levels of incompetence that were there at all different levels, including things that are purely mechanical, but like the ability to design an appropriate questionnaire form. But yes, of course, a drug which is supposed to be given for the rest of somebody's life, if you have something tested for only a few weeks, you have a very poor idea of, what to expect from it. Especially the Boston study, they would claim someone was in much longer than was claimed on the case report forms, and this meant that simply the doctors received a great deal more money. But far more important than this was the reporting of the adverse effects, the toxicities. And this was, the heart of what the study was to measure, that it was safe. And there were many of their patients would have died from the toxicities of AZT if they had not been given emergency blood transfusions. This is serious adverse effect. It means literally that they would have died from the poison. And yet the case report forms, which showed up eventually as official data, they would report no adverse effects. I mean, this is a type of dishonesty. It's hard to go any further than that. Well, the most outrageous case, I forget which one it was, but it was someone who had already been taking AZT, which a few people could. They wanted the new miracle drug, and they were able to get it before it was approved for marketing. And he was entered as a patient in the placebo group. Even though he was still taking AZT, he dropped out almost immediately, but continued to take AZT, and then he died. And they called him a death in the placebo group. I mean, it's hard to cheat any more than that. Of those who were given AZT, they all suffered really severe side effects. Side effect is misleading, toxicities. But a number of them would very definitely have died from anemia, which in the review of animal studies, AZT causes anemia in every species of animal that's ever been studied, including human beings. But they would have died if they had not been given emergency blood transfusions. And yet, according to the official data, the case report forms, these people had no adverse, reactions. The one single most unforgivable thing, there was cheating. There's no reason to believe that Boston, one of 12 centers, was the only one in which cheating took place. It's very likely that the same cheating, maybe even worse, took place in all 11 others. It's just that Boston happened to get an honest investigative team that did their work. Many of the others were going to be investigated thoroughly, and then they said, oh, we just don't have time, so we don't know. But to me, the single worst thing is that they deliberately used data they knew were false. That's the one single thing that can never be forgiven.
And we did the first randomized placebo-controlled trial with AZT, which turned out to give an effect that was modest.
What do you know, John? What would you guess for the number of people who were really sickened and killed who had no presenting illnesses, just a positive test for the proteins, for the antibodies that were supposed to be specific to HIV? How many people were we killing with this drug?
Well, here one has to guess. I followed the CDC's statistics very well year by year, but then they stopped reporting certain things. But I have a pretty good estimate that 1/3 gay men were killed by AZT poisoning. And I have a table I created, it's on my website somewhere.
Wow.
I would say, I don't even know now. They stopped reporting AIDS deaths by year, which made it impossible to track certain things.
Yeah, I noticed that also, that the statistics, especially around 1997, was a big year where the next year, all of a sudden, they removed all the good stuff out of the reports. All that really they concentrate now on is how many cases there are in each city and each state, which I guess is purely for funding purposes.
Well, I think it's deliberate. I don't think they want tracking to be done on their statistics.
Well, if you take a look at their own statistics, though, you take a look at those 1983, 84, 85, 86, 87, really, we're talking a relative handful in a country of then to 50 million, to 60, to 70 million people, maybe 5,000, 10,000 people. It really wasn't until the late 80s when AZT came along that we really saw, even by their own figures, the number of deaths attributed to AIDS going up. That was at the point that this chemotherapy for life, this harsh drug, AZT, was being introduced.